The purpose of this video is to introduce some of the forms that we see in the classical era. So I'd like to start by asking you, what is form? Do you remember in the elements we heard some examples of binary form and ternary form, which are some pretty simple examples. Form is the way that a composer structures a piece of music. So whether it's a short piece and a simple piece, or whether it's even a movement from a symphony, it's still based on the ideas of repetition, contrast, and variation. Why is form so important in the classical period? Well, the reason that form is important in the classical period is that the music that we're going to be hearing is what's called absolute music. The favored type of music in the classical period was absolute music. That is, it was free of any kind of story or pre-existing program that would tie the music together. And for that reason, structurally, it had to be really sound. I'd like to start by showing you a picture that's in your book in chapter 21. This is a diagram or a chart for what's called the sonata cycle. It's the general scheme or large-scale overall plan for example, if you were going to hear a symphony. And as you'll see, when we get to Beethoven, he did not reject this. He kept it. And in fact, some of the composers after him, like Brahms, Dvorak, they kept it as well. Others kept certain ideas, but either expanded on them, or some of them actually rejected this. But all in all, these movements, these designs don't go away. Even in the 20th and even 21st centuries, some composers still follow this overall format. So what I'd like to talk about in this video is especially the first movement, which is called sonata form. Let me take just a quick step back and make sure that you guys are familiar with what a movement is. A movement would be a part of something bigger. So if you were to go listen to a symphony, you might want to applaud after you heard the first movement, but actually you're supposed to not applaud until the very end of the piece, but it's part of something bigger. If you were to go to a symphony, or even something smaller like a string quartet, or other kind of what's called chamber piece, you would find that a lot of pieces, not all of them, but a lot, have more than one movement. So if you were to go hear a traditional symphony, there would be 4 parts or 4 movements. The first movement is usually it's usually fast, and there might be a slow introduction, but a lot of times it starts out just fast. The form for the first movement is called sonata form, also known as sonata allegro form. Usually the second movement is slow in tempo. As far as the form goes, the form can vary for the second movement. That's not written in stone what it's going to be. A lot of composers, like Haydn especially, and Beethoven, who studied with Haydn, liked a form called theme and variations, which is basically take a musical idea and keep bringing back that musical idea with some kind of modifications. Certain features are changed while others are retained. That's variations form. You might also find the second movement could be sonata form once again. It could be an ABA form. It could be something called a rondo form. The third movement was usually dance related. We have a really good example of the third movement on the elements of music. We have Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik, a little night music, the third movement. This is a minuet. It was actually not to be danced to anymore. By the time we get to this period in history, these were dance-related, or dance-inspired, I should say, but you still would sit down and listen to them, not get up and dance. Beethoven kept the idea of the ternary form for the third movement. The minuet trio was a ternary form movement, and he replaced it with something called the scherzo. We hear the third movement from Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 is a great example of that ternary form, and it's a scherzo. The last movement in the sonata cycle, it was usually the fastest in tempo, and once again it could be a sonata form, or it could also be something called a rondo form. The fourth movement of Symphony No. 5 by Beethoven is an example of sonata form once again. But if you go back to the elements of music, what is given to us as an example is a piece by Moret, and it's an example of a rondo. All right, let's take a look at the first movement. I'd like to zoom in on just the first movement, which is called sonata form or sonata allegro form. In your book, in chapter 21, you'll see a kind of a roadmap for sonata form, and it looks a little daunting at first, all these different colors. I want to remind you that with sonata form, that the idea in the classical period was to have some kind of variety. The audience was a growing middle class audience, and they didn't want to be bored with just one main theme. So the idea was that you would have some kind of variety, and that's why when you look at column number 1 where it says exposition, why you have two different colors. One is the first theme, and then you have the other, which is the second theme or second thematic group. The point is that classical composers and the audience wanted some kind of variety, so you've got different colors here. All right, so is your head hurting yet? Let me explain that sonata form or sonata allegro form is also kind of like ternary form or ABA form. If you take a look at the colors there, you may be able to see that. Think of the first part, it's called the exposition, as where the contrasting ideas are stated. We can think of that like the A section. The development section you can think of as the contrasting or B section. And then in the what's called the recapitulation, the third section, those ideas that we heard in the exposition come back. So you can think of it like a restatement, ABA. It is a little bit more complicated than that because these themes are developed. And so that's why we have a fancier name. I want to show you guys a different visual for this. I took this from a different book, but I think that it might be helpful. Okay, here's sonata form. Here's the roadmap. We have the three sections: exposition, development, recapitulation. There's a little thing at the end called a coda. That's the Italian word for tail, and that's just, if you're at a symphony concert, that would be where the conductor's just sort of flapping their arms to signify the closing chords. They can be pretty short. We'll hear with Beethoven how he expanded on the coda, but typically in a classical piece, the coda is pretty short. Okay, let's back up to the exposition. This would be the first part of this movement, and at the beginning there may be a slow introduction, but a lot of times it just goes right into the first theme that's in the tonic key or the home key. That first theme will be in that home key, and by the way, that home key is usually given in the title. For example, Mozart Symphony No. 40 in G minor. G minor would be the tonic key. That means that the melodic material is based on the G minor scale. Beethoven Symphony No. 5 in C minor. That first theme is in the key of C minor. You see this little, after the first theme is stated, you see this bridge, which is transitional material that takes us to a new key area called the second theme. In Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor, the second theme is not only different in character, it's much more lyrical sounding, but it's also in a different key. So that's why in your book they give you a different color, little different colored block to show you that the second theme contrasts. This may be followed by some more melodic material that's in that second key area, kind of up to the composer, and then you have that what's called a cadence theme, where the musical material will, it sounds like it's cadencing, and usually it's pretty clear cut. You can tell that it's the end of that section. Then we go on into the next section called development, and this is where the composer develops the melodic material. It kind of depends on which composer you're listening to. It's not written in stone. It's not a rigid mold, but sometimes the composer will develop just the first theme or the second theme or both. You have a really good example of the first movement from Mozart's Little Night Music, Eine kleine Nachtmusik, where he develops the material from the first theme. Why is that blue line all jagged looking? Well, it's because in this section the composer likes to take the theme and usually break it down into smaller parts and kind of toss it from key area to key area. This is the part that sounds like it's not at rest. And if you think about sonata form, this idea of having contrasting thematic ideas, the development kind of adds to that feeling of tension. At the end of the development section, you'll hear something called it's called the retransition, and what the composer does is it gives you the dominant chord. That's the chord that's built on the 5th note of the scale, and it signifies to the ear that it's going to go somewhere that you can expect. And boom, in comes back in the first theme, like we heard at the very beginning of the piece, which signifies the recapitulation. Notice that the first theme returns in the tonic key, in the home key, and notice that it's a flat line. The bridge is this transitional material, but it doesn't take us to a new key area. Instead, it stays in the same key. So now the second theme will be the same melodic material, but now it will stay in the home key, which is kind of a reconciliation of sorts. After that is followed by the other themes that are in that same key, and here it's stable. You've got that flat blue line, and then it sounds like the piece could be over, and the composer usually adds the closing chords to round off the piece. That is sonata form. And I would ask you guys to go to chapter 21 and to that chart, and click the iMusic and listen to these examples of sonata form. Depending on how much time you want to spend on it, there's a lot of material you can listen to, many examples. At the very least, do listen to the first movement of Eine kleine Nachtmusik. I'm also going to provide another visual in a video for you to follow along with. I think it's a little more detailed than what you guys have in the Elements of Music. And then I also would ask, more important, or I would say as important, is to listen to all of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 so that you can hear how he retains these forms and also how he expands on them.